It is May 14th, 1995, Mother's Day. In a quiet house in Cumberland, Maryland, Deborah Skelly is sitting near the phone. Like millions of other mothers across the country, she is expecting a call. Her son, Donald Izzett Jr., everyone calls him Donnie, is 19 years old. He's a boy with a wide, thin smile and dark eyebrows that make him look even younger than he is. He is a journalism student, a talented track runner, and a young man who once sat down at 17 years old to write a poem for his mother, calling her his best friend through all the pain they had endured together. The phone finally rings, but the voice on the other end isn't the happy, independent son Deborah saw just a week earlier. Donnie is hysterical. He is 3,000 miles away in Santa Monica, California, and he is sobbing so hard he can barely breathe. He tells her he's done. He's finished with the road trip. He begs her to wire money right away so he can get a plane ticket and fly back to the safety of Western Maryland. Deborah feels that cold spike of fear in her chest. She asks him where he is, but Donnie's voice goes tight. He sounds like he's trying to whisper, like he's terrified that someone is standing right behind him. And then, the peace of that Sunday morning is shattered. Deborah hears a scuffle, the sound of feet dragging, a muffled struggle, an odd noise she can't quite identify. Then, a single, sharp scream rips through the receiver. The line goes dead. Deborah dials back over and over, but there is no answer. She calls the police in Maryland, her voice shaking as she describes the scream. But this is 1995. Donnie is 19 years old. To the state troopers, he isn't a victim. He's just a legal adult who decided to stop talking to his mom. They tell her he left on his own free will. They tell her to wait. But her mother knows. A month later, in the middle of the night, Deborah sits straight up in her bed, gasping for air. She looks at her husband and says the words that will haunt her for the next 30 years. Donnie's dead. I know he is. I don't know how to explain it, but I know. Welcome to Cold Case Files. I'm your host, and today we are untangling a mystery that spans 3 decades, a shocking confession from a best friend, and a mother's relentless quest for justice in the face of a system that looked at her son and saw a runaway instead of a homicide. Before we dive into the heart of this mystery, I want to take a second to check in with all of you. We have a massive community here from every corner of the world, and your support is what keeps these cases alive. Where are you watching from today? What time is it there, and what is the weather like in your part of the world? In Santa Monica that May, it was the season of May gray, where the clouds hang low and the air feels heavy before the sun finally breaks through. Let us know if it's clear or overcast where you are in the comments. It helps the channel more than you know. If you are new here and you find value in these deep dives into the forgotten corners of American justice, please hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. We don't stop until the names of the missing are spoken and the truth is uncovered. To understand why Donnie was crying on that pier in California, we have to look at the months leading up to the trip. Donnie was a brilliant kid, graduating near the top of his class at Fort Hill High School. But he was also a young man searching for his identity in an era that wasn't always kind to people like him. In February 1994, Donnie had enlisted in the United States Air Force. He wanted to serve, to find a sense of order. But just 1 month later, he was discharged under the don't ask, don't tell policy after admitting he was gay. This rejection hit him hard. He felt like he had been kicked out of a future he was trying to build. When he came home to Maryland, the tension didn't stop. He came out to Deborah, and she admits now, with a voice full of regret, that she didn't handle it well. She suggested counseling. She said things she wishes she could take back. They had a gigantic fight, and though they made up quickly, Deborah has carried a self-immolating guilt ever since. She believes that the distance created by that fight made Donnie vulnerable. It made him want to run. It made him pack his bags on May 9, 1995, and tell her he was taking a break from his journalism studies to go on a vacation he left with a man named George Thompson Ganther, known to everyone as Shane. Shane was a former aerobics instructor from West Hollywood, a man described as charismatic, but possessing a volatile, allegedly abusive edge. They hopped into Shane's British racing green Mazda Miata and headed south, then west. By the time they reached Santa Monica, that vacation had turned into a nightmare. Donnie was desperate to escape Shane, desperate to get home to the mother he had been fighting with just months before. But because the police refused to list him as a missing person until August, 3 months after the scream on the phone, the trail was allowed to grow cold before it even began. The green Miata was gone. Donnie was gone, and for 5 months, the only thing Deborah had was the sound of that scream echoing in her head. To truly understand the young man who was sobbing on a Santa Monica pier on Mother's Day, we have to look at the pressure cooker he was living in during the early months of 1994 and 1995. Donnie wasn't a troubled kid in the traditional sense. He was the kind of student teachers in Cumberland, Maryland, still talk about smart, athletic, and possessed by a quiet, burning ambition. He graduated near the top of his class at Fort Hill High School in 1993. He was a runner, a boy used to pushing his body to the limit, and he looked at the horizon with the expectation that he could conquer whatever was beyond it. He enlisted in the United States Army that July. He wanted to serve, but the distance from Western Maryland felt like a physical weight, and he sought a discharge to stay close to his mother. But Donnie was restless. In February 1994, he tried again, this time joining the United States Air Force. This was supposed to be his path, his way to find discipline and purpose. But this was also the era of a policy that would dismantle the lives of thousands of young Americans. Donnie was living under the shadow of Don't Tell. For a 19-year-old trying to figure out who he was, the military wasn't a refuge. It was a trap. In March 1994, only a month after he joined, Donnie made a choice that changed the trajectory of his life. He was honest. He told his superiors he was gay. The institutional rejection was swift and cold. He was discharged immediately. For a boy who had been a star student and a dedicated athlete, being told he wasn't fit for service because of who he loved was a wound that refused to close. He came back to Maryland and tried to bury himself in his books, enrolling at Frostburg State University to study journalism. He was a book lover, a writer, someone who looked for meaning in the rhythm of a sentence. But at home, the air was thick with a tension that neither he nor his mother knew how to break. Deborah remembers that year with a raw, bleeding honesty. When Donnie came out to her, she didn't give him the grace he needed. She admits now that she suggested counseling. She wanted him to be a doctor, to follow a traditional path she thought would protect him from a world she knew could be cruel. They had a gigantic fight, an explosive moment of misunderstanding that left a crack in their foundation. Even though they made up quickly, Deborah has carried a weight ever since that is hard to describe. She believes that the distance created by that argument made Donnie vulnerable. It made him want to run. It made him pack his bags on May 9, 1995, and tell her he was taking a break from his studies to go on a vacation. That is when Shane Gwenter entered the frame. Shane was older, an aerobics instructor from West Hollywood, a place that must have sounded like a neon paradise to a 19-year-old from the quiet hills of Maryland. Shane was charismatic, fit, and part of a community Donnie was, desperate to join. But those who saw them together said the relationship wasn't a romance. They described Shane as volatile, even allegedly abusive. Donnie was a boy looking for a mentor, but the person he found may have had a much darker agenda. On May 9, 1995, Donnie walked out of his dorm at Frostburg State for the last time. He packed a small bag and climbed into Shane's British racing green Mazda Miata. It is a tiny car, cramped, intimate, and entirely too small for two men on a cross-country journey. They headed south through Florida, then Louisiana, then west toward the Pacific. On the surface, it looked like the ultimate American road trip, but the phone calls back home told a different story. Donnie was becoming increasingly isolated. He was no longer the driver of his own life. He was a passenger in someone else's drama. By the time they reached the California coast, the vacation had turned into a desperate flight. Donnie was calling Deborah, crying, begging for a way out. And then came that scream on May 14th. When the line went dead, Deborah didn't just sit there. She went to the Maryland State Police immediately. She told them about the hysterical sobbing, the sound of her son's voice being cut off. But the system in the mid-90s was built to fail adults who went missing. To the troopers, Donnie was 19. He was a legal adult. He had a car, or at least he was in one. In their eyes, he was just another kid who didn't want to come home. They told Deborah that unless there was a witness to a kidnapping or blood on the pavement, their hands were tied. This refusal to act created a 3-month window of silence. 3 months where the green Miata could have been tracked across state lines. 3 months where Shane could have been questioned while his story was still fresh. But the Maryland State Police stood their ground. They didn't officially list Donnie as a missing person until August 1995. By then, the car had crossed half a dozen borders. The trail in Santa Monica was stone cold, and in Pike County, Mississippi, a small farmhouse was sitting quietly at the end of a long gravel driveway, holding onto a secret that would take 30 years to pull from the earth. Deborah spent those 3 months screaming into a void. She was an impoverished mother, a woman who knew the law but couldn't make it work for her son. She was told to be patient. She was told he would show up eventually. But every night she would wake up in a cold sweat, hearing the echoes of that Mother's Day call. She knew her son wasn't just traveling for enjoyment, her son would later claim. She knew he had been silenced, and while the police were waiting for Donnie to just walk back through the door, the green Miata was moving through the desert, heading toward a destination Donnie would never leave. For 5 long months, Deborah Skelly lived in a state of suspended animation. Imagine the quiet of a house in Cumberland, Maryland, where every ring of the telephone feels like a physical blow, and every sunset is a reminder that another day has passed without a word from your child. The Maryland State Police had essentially closed the book on Donnie, treating him like a legal adult who had simply exercised his right to walk away from his life. They saw a 19-year-old on a road trip. Deborah saw a 19-year-old who had screamed and disappeared. The break didn't come from a detective's desk or a high-tech forensic lab. It came in the mail. In October 1995, a letter arrived from the small town of Buckeye, Arizona. It wasn't a letter of hope, at least not on the surface. It was a notice for an overdue speeding ticket issued to Donald Izzett. But when Deborah looked at the date on that citation, her heart nearly stopped. The ticket was issued on May 22, 1995. Think about that timeline for a moment. Donnie's last call to his mother, the one where he was sobbing and begging for money, the one that ended with a scream and a deadline, was on Mother's Day. May 14th. For 5 months, Deborah had been haunted by the idea that her son had been killed in that very moment in Santa Monica. This piece of paper proved that 8 days after that terrifying call, Donnie was still alive. He was driving through the Arizona desert, more than 300 miles east of where he had last spoken to her. The ticket told a story in its margins. Donnie had been pulled over in a British racing green Mazda Miata. This was the same car Shane Gwenter owned, the same car they had left Maryland in just weeks before. Donnie was behind the wheel, still moving, still in the company of the man who would become the primary focus of this decades-long search. Deborah isn't just a grieving mother. She is a woman with a degree in criminal justice and psychology. She knew that this ticket was more than a fine. It was a roadmap. She contacted the authorities in Buckeye and learned that while Donnie had been the one driving, he had failed to show up for his scheduled court date on June 27th. After that date, the paper trail for Donald Izzett went completely dark. Using the registration information from the Miata, Deborah tracked the vehicle to George Thompson Genther, Shane. She discovered that the Gwenter family didn't just have ties to California. They owned a sprawling, isolated farmhouse in Macomb, Mississippi. Deborah picked up the phone and dialed the Genther residence. This was the moment where the investigation shifted from the Pacific coast to the deep south. Shane's mother, Sue Genther, answered the call. When Deborah asked if she knew where Donnie was, Sue didn't sound surprised. She confirmed that Donnie had been there at their home in Pike County in late May 1995, but the details Sue provided were far from comforting. She described witnessing a massive, violent argument between Shane and Donnie in her own driveway. She saw the tension between them boil over. According to Sue, the two men eventually climbed back into that green Miata and drove away together. Shane returned to the farmhouse later that night, but he was alone. When Sue asked her son where Donnie was, Shane gave her an answer that became his primary alibi for the next 30 years. He claimed he had driven Donnie to the French Quarter of New Orleans and dropped him off. He told his mother that Donnie had met another man there and decided to stay behind. He claimed he hadn't seen or heard from Donnie since that night in the late spring of 1995. For the police, this was enough of an explanation to stay hands-off. In their view, if Donnie was last seen in New Orleans by his own choice, there was no crime to investigate. But Deborah knew better. She knew her son's journalism studies were everything to him. She knew he had no money and no reason to disappear into the streets of New Orleans without a single call back to Maryland. The Arizona paper trail had proved that Donnie survived the scuffle in Santa Monica. But it also proved something much more ominous. It showed that he was being funneled toward Mississippi, toward a place where the trees grow thick and the ground can keep a secret for a very long time. This single speeding ticket became the anchor for everything that followed, the catalyst for a mother to travel to a town she had never heard of, to confront a family she didn't know, all in the hopes of finding what happened to the boy who never came home from vacation. The lead from Arizona was a spark, but the fire was waiting in Mississippi. Deborah Skelly didn't hesitate. She took that information and pointed her life toward Pike County, a place where the humidity clings to you like a second skin and the pine forests seem to stretch on forever. McComb, Mississippi, is a town built on the legacy of the railroad industry, a place where people know their neighbors and secrets are often kept within the walls of a family home. For a mother from the mountains of Maryland, it was a land of strangers and a heavy-weighted silence. Deborah's research led her to a specific patch of land in Fernwood, just outside the Macomb city limits. This was the Genther family property, a remote farmhouse sitting at the end of a long, quiet road. It wasn't the kind of place a journalism student from Frostburg State University would end up by accident. It was a destination. When Deborah first reached out to Shane's mother, Sue Gunther, the conversation stripped away any remaining hope that this was just a simple misunderstanding. Sue didn't try to hide that Donnie had been there. She admitted that in late May of 1995, Donnie and Shane had arrived at the farmhouse in that British racing green Mazda Miata. But their visit wasn't a peaceful one. Sue described a scene that has haunted Deborah for 3 decades. She stood in her own driveway and watched as Shane and Donnie engaged in a massive, screaming argument. The tension was thick enough to feel. According to Sue, the two men eventually got back into the tiny car and drove away together, leaving the farmhouse behind. When Shane returned to the property later that same night, he was alone. Donnie was nowhere to be seen. Shane's story to his mother was simple, and it became the wall that investigators would hit for the next 25 years. He claimed he had driven Donnie 100 miles south to the French Quarter of New Orleans. He told Sue that Donnie had met another man there and decided to stay behind to start a new life. Shane insisted he had simply dropped him off and never saw him again. For Deborah, this alibi didn't hold up under the weight of common sense. Donnie had no money, no extra clothes, and he had just called her on Mother's Day crying and begging to come home. He wasn't looking for a new life in New Orleans. He was looking for a way back to Maryland. But because Donnie was 19 years old, the authorities in both Maryland and Mississippi were happy to accept Shane's version of events. They told Deborah that if her son wanted to disappear in the French Quarter, that was his business. Then there was the matter of the car seat. This is one of those small, nagging details that screams louder than a confession. Shortly after Donnie vanished, Shane allegedly removed the passenger seat from his Mazda Miata. When people asked why, he had a ready-made excuse. He said he was transporting puppies and needed the extra room. It's a detail that doesn't fit the narrative of a simple drop-off in New Orleans. Why would you need to gut your car to move dogs if you had just dropped off a friend? To Deborah, the missing seat was evidence of a cleanup, a desperate attempt to erase blood or struggle marks from a cramped space. The search in the late 1990s was a series of closed doors and half-hearted glances. The Pike County Sheriff's Department did a basic sweep of the property, but they were looking for a body that hadn't been found, and they didn't have the tools to look for what had been burned. Shane eventually moved away, settling thousands of miles away in Washington state, leaving the farmhouse and the memories behind. Deborah was left as a lone voice in the wilderness. She was an impoverished mother, a woman who had to choose between paying her bills and traveling to Mississippi to beg for answers. She spent her own limited funds to uncover leads that the police should have been handling. She was discouraged at every turn. The Maryland State Police told her to stop calling. The Mississippi authorities told her there was no evidence of a crime. For over 20 years, the Macomb farmhouse sat in the sun, its graveled driveway, holding on to the secrets of that May afternoon. Deborah never stopped believing that the truth was right there, buried beneath the topsoil or hidden in the shadows of the pine trees. She was a woman fighting a system that preferred to look away, a mother who knew that voluntary disappearance was a lie built to protect a killer. The shadows in Mississippi were long, but Deborah Skelly was willing to spend the rest of her life walking through them. For more than 20 years, the case of Donald Izzett Jr. existed in a kind of frozen state. While the rest of the world moved into a new millennium, while technology changed the way we communicate and live, Deborah Skelly remained anchored to 1995. She was living in a world of paper files and unanswered letters. The Maryland State Police had essentially stopped taking her calls. To them, the pot inquiry was done. They had a story. A young man who had a fight with his mother and decided to start a new life in New Orleans. And they were sticking to it. But before we get into the moment the silence was finally shattered, I want to take a beat and bring this back to all of you. We see the numbers in the analytics, but behind those numbers are real people. Where are you watching from today? What time is it on your clock? And what is the weather doing outside your window? In Cumberland, Maryland, the winters are often gray and heavy with snow, and the summers are thick with humidity. It is the kind of place where you notice when someone is missing because the community is so tightly knit. Let us know what the atmosphere is like in your town. It helps us feel a little more connected in this digital space. If you are still here, it is because you believe that every name matters. If you think a mother's intuition is a force of nature that can't be ignored, hit that like button. Your engagement tells the world that Donald Izzett hasn't been forgotten. The years between 1996 and 2016 were what David Ridgen, the host of the podcast Someone Knows Something, describes as a period of self-immolating guilt. For Deborah, imagine waking up every single morning for 2 decades, wondering if the last thing you said to your son was the reason he ran into the arms of a predator. Deborah lived with the weight of that Mother's Day call on a continuous loop in her head. She replayed their arguments about his sexuality, her initial lack of acceptance, and her suggestion that he seek counseling. She called this the partial truth propaganda we tell ourselves. We convince ourselves that we are responsible for the darkness that finds our loved ones. It is a way of trying to find order in the chaos of a disappearance. If it was her fault, then maybe she could fix it. But as the decades piled up, Deborah realized that the only way to heal was to find the truth, no matter how much it cost her. A major shift occurred in 2016. After years of being told to go away, an officer in Maryland finally did something unexpected. They allowed Deborah to sit down and copy the entire case file. We are talking about 340 pages of interviews, notes and leads that had been gathered in the first few months of the search. As Deborah flipped through those pages, she wasn't just a grieving mother anymore. She became a specialist. She began to see the names that kept surfacing. Names of people who had been in Macomb that week, but had never been truly interrogated. She saw the gaps where the police had failed to follow up on Shane's alibi. She saw the British racing green Mazda Miata mentioned again and again, but never processed for forensic evidence. This was the moment the inquiry gained a new kind of momentum. It was no longer a lone woman screaming into the wind. In 2020, the world joined her through the 6th season of Someone Knows Something. This wasn't just true crime for entertainment. It was a collaborative effort between a documentarian and a mother to shake the trees in Mississippi and see what fell out. The story was no longer about a 19-year-old runaway. It was about a 19-year-old victim. And as the spotlight grew brighter, the people who had stayed quiet for 25 years began to feel the heat. One of those people was a man who had been mentioned in the files, but never pushed for the truth. His name was Kyle Barnes. We are about to move into the most intense part of this narrative. We are moving toward the moment a best friend finally looked at the camera and described exactly what happened in the trunk of that green Miata. The silence was over. The truth was coming for Shane Gunther. For over 2 decades, the investigation into Donald Izzett's disappearance felt like a puzzle with missing pieces that had been intentionally thrown away. The authorities had a suspect in Shane Gunther, but they had no body, no weapon, and no witness willing to speak. That changed in 2019 when the silence was finally shattered by a man named Kyle Everett Barnes. Kyle wasn't just a casual acquaintance. He was Shane's best friend and roommate in West Hollywood, a man who had been inside the inner circle during the summer Donnie vanished. For 24 years, Kyle had carried a secret that was eating him alive from the inside out. When he finally sat down with investigators, the story he told wasn't just a tip. It was a step-by-step account of a murder and a cover-up that had stayed hidden in the shadows of the Mississippi woods for a generation. Kyle described a night in late May 1995 that began with a frantic, sobbing phone call. Shane was in Mississippi, and he sounded like a man who had completely come apart. He was hysterical, begging Kyle to fly out and help him. Shane's grandmother eventually paid for the plane ticket, and Kyle flew from California to New Orleans, where Shane was waiting to pick him up. The drive from the airport to the McComb farmhouse was filled with a thick, heavy tension. Shane was a wreck, tearful and panicked. When they finally arrived at the secluded property in Fernwood, Shane led Kyle to the British racing green Mazda Miata, the same car Donnie had been seen driving just days before. Shane walked to the back of the car and popped the trunk. Inside, Kyle saw something that would haunt his dreams for the next 30 years. He saw the naked body of 19-year-old Donald Izzett curled up in the cramped space of the trunk. Kyle described seeing 3 distinct bullet holes in Donnie's back. It was a brutal, one-sided execution. Shane allegedly told Kyle the reason for the violence was a dark, obsessive jealousy. According to the confession, Shane had looked at Donnie and said, "If I can't have you, then no one can have you." Shane had watched the life leave Donnie's eyes right there on the property. Kyle admitted that in the heat of that moment, he didn't run to the police. He was scared, and he was suggestible. In a moment of absolute darkness, Kyle claimed it was actually his own suggestion to dispose of the remains in a way that would ensure no one ever found them. He told Shane that burying a body was too risky, the ground could be dug up, and secrets could be unearthed. Instead, he suggested they use fire. They allegedly built a massive fire pit on the Gwenter property. They moved Donnie's body from the Miata into the flames and kept the fire roaring through the night. They stayed there until the body was reduced to nothing but ash and small, unrecognizable fragments of bone. Shane believed that with the body gone, no one would ever come looking for Donnie, except for maybe his mother. He thought he could outrun the truth. Kyle's confession was so detailed that investigators even used a hypnosis session to help him retrieve specific memories of the layout of the property and the mechanics of the crime.
That night to have a bonfire, and we burned the body. And the next day he drove me back to New Orleans, and I flew home and never talked to anybody about it, never heard, no one ever asked me about it, no one ever talked to me about it until 24 years later.
Kyle Barnes had given the district attorney the location of the burn event and a motive that fit everything Deborah had suspected about Shane's volatile nature. The silence of the Mississippi farmhouse was over. The story was out, and for the first time in nearly a quarter of a century, the authorities had a map that led directly to the spot where Donald Izzett Jr. was allegedly erased from existence. Fernwood, Mississippi, a place where the humidity feels like a heavy, wet blanket and the red clay ground holds its secrets with a stubborn grip. For years, this patch of land was just a quiet corner of a family property, an isolated stretch of trees and dirt. But in June 2019, it became a forensic battlefield. A team of specialized archaeologists, led by a woman named Lynn Funkhauser, arrived with brushes, screens, and a purpose that had been 24 years in the making. They weren't looking for a grave in the traditional sense. They were looking for the aftermath of what investigators call a burn event, a place where the earth had been scorched so intensely that it changed the very chemistry of the soil. Kyle Barnes had pointed them here. He had described a fire that roared through the night, a fire meant to erase a 19-year-old boy from the world. The work was painstaking and physical. Imagine standing under the relentless southern sun, sifting through bucket after bucket of dirt, looking for something no larger than a fingernail. Every stone had to be turned, every root inspected. Then, the metal screens caught something. Just beneath the surface, under the roots of the grass, they found them. Tiny, charred fragments of bone. Truett Simmons, an investigator for the district attorney, looked at the fragments. He didn't use clinical, detached language. He said there was a high probability these were human remains. For the first time in 2.5 decades, the theory of a mother had become physical evidence. The air on the property shifted. It wasn't just a cold case anymore. It was a recovery mission. Deborah Skelly was there, watching every scoop of dirt with an intensity that only a mother can possess. Can you imagine the internal war she was fighting in that moment? You want to find him, so the mystery ends, but finding him means accepting the finality of that scream on the phone. When the archaeologist told her they were confident, Deborah didn't just thank them. She fell into their arms. She hugged them weeping, feeling the weight of 24 years of being ignored finally begin to lift. They were very probably human, the experts told her, but science has a way of being as stubborn as the Mississippi clay. While Lynn Funkhauser and the local investigators felt they had found Donnie, a forensic anthropologist named Dr. Stephen Sims later threw a bucket of cold water on the discovery. He examined the fragments and concluded they were not human remains. This created a devastating rift in the investigation. Was it human bone that had been so badly burned it lost its recognizable structure, or was it something else entirely? The conflict highlights the impossible task of forensic archaeology when fire is involved. Extreme heat causes bone to shrink and warp. It destroys the marrow and the delicate structures that usually tell the story of who a person was. But Deborah wouldn't let the disagreement stop the momentum. In 2020, she brought in the heavy hitters, cadaver dogs with names like Grief. These aren't just pets. They are biological sensors trained to find the scent of human death even decades after the fact. The dogs signaled on specific areas of that Fernwood property, breathing life back into the search. The story didn't end there. In 22, they went back in. Another dig, more sifting, and more evidence recovered. The fragments found in these recent years are different. They're being handled with the knowledge of 2026 technology. They aren't just being looked at under a microscope. They are being prepared for the forensic-grade genome sequencing that labs like Othram have perfected. The Fernwood property is no longer just a farmhouse. It is a witness. Every fragment pulled from that soil is a potential bridge to the justice that Shane Gwenther thought he could burn away. The investigators are waiting. Deborah is waiting. And somewhere in a lab, the tiny charred remains are being asked to finally speak the name of the boy who went on vacation and never came home. The fragments pulled from the Mississippi soil were a scientific question mark. While the archaeologists in Fernwood felt they had found the truth, the criminal justice system was paralyzed. It is a harsh reality of the American legal system. Without a body, or at least a scientifically confirmed piece of one, bringing murder charges is an uphill battle that most prosecutors are afraid to climb. They wanted a definitive yes from the anthropologists, but all they had were debated fragments and a confession from a man with a complicated past. Deborah Skelly was exhausted. She had spent over 2 decades begging police to care about her son. She had copied 340 pages of files herself. She had watched as the green Miata was sold and the trail was allowed to wash away. But she wasn't done. If the state of Mississippi wouldn't seat a jury for a criminal trial, she would use the only other weapon she had left. She would sue. In May 2019, a bold legal move was made. The estate of Donald Izzett Jr. filed a civil wrongful death lawsuit in the United States District Court for the Southern District of Mississippi. The case was assigned a number that would become the new focus of Deborah's life, 5:2019 CV 0004. This wasn't a search for money. For Deborah, this was a way to force Shane Gwenther, who was then living thousands of miles away in Bremerton, Washington, to finally look at the evidence. In a civil trial, the burden of proof is lower than in a criminal one. You don't have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. You only have to show that a preponderance of the evidence suggests the person is responsible. Deborah believed that between the Arizona speeding ticket, the fight Shane's own mother witnessed, and the haunting confession of Kyle Barnes, she could finally get a judgment that said what she already knew. Shane killed Donnie. Her legal team, led by Ronnie Whittington from Macomb and Bill Goodwin from New Orleans, took on the challenge. They were fighting against a formidable defense. Shane was represented by Cynthia Speechens, a lawyer from Madison, Mississippi, who didn't pull any punches. Speechens was clinical and direct. She argued that the entire lawsuit was built on shadows. Her defense was simple and devastating. The plaintiff had absolutely no proof that Donald Izzett was even dead, let alone that Shane had anything to do with it. Imagine the weight of that argument on a mother's heart. To sit in a legal proceeding and hear a lawyer say there is no proof your son is gone, even though you heard his final scream on the phone 24 years earlier. This is where the ethics of the law get messy. I want to stop and ask you, how do you feel about cases like this? When the criminal system stalls, do you think civil lawsuits are a fair way to get justice? Or does it feel like a consolation prize for a family that deserves a murder conviction? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. This is a debate that divides the true crime community every single day. As 2019 turned into 2020, the case began to move toward a trial. A 3-week bench trial was scheduled to begin on September 21st, 2020 before District Judge David C. Brummett III. This was the closest Deborah had ever come to her day in court. Documents were being subpoenaed from the Pike County Sheriff's Department. Depositions were being scheduled. The pressure was mounting. Then the world changed. In March 2020, just as the global pandemic was shutting down courtrooms across the country, a different kind of resolution began to take shape. On March 6, the telephonic settlement conference was held before Magistrate Judge Michael T. Parker. The lawyers for both sides dialed into a conference bridge. Shane was on the line. Deborah was on the line. Behind the scenes, a deal was struck. On April 1, 2020, Judge Brummett signed an official, agreed order of dismissal with prejudice. Shane Genther agreed to pay an undisclosed, confidential, monetary sum to the same estate of the boy he was accused of killing. In exchange, the civil claims against him were dropped forever. A settlement like this is not an admission of guilt. In the eyes of the law, Shane Genther walked away as a man who had settled a private dispute. But for the community following the case, the optics were different. Why would a man pay a confidential sum to the family of a missing friend? If he truly had nothing to hide, the cost of this justice was high. The lawyers took 40% of the settlement plus their expenses. Deborah wasn't left with a fortune. She was left with enough to perhaps fund the next stage of her search. But the void where Donnie used to be remained wide open. The civil case was over, dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could never be brought again. Shane had bought himself a shield against future civil liability, but there is one thing a civil settlement cannot protect you from: a criminal indictment. As Deborah walked away from the federal courthouse, she knew the clock was still ticking. The settlement was accountability, but it wasn't the end. The real ending was still waiting in a laboratory where tiny fragments of bone were about to meet the most advanced forensic technology the world has ever seen. The legal gambit was over, but the scientific one was just beginning. The civil settlement of 2020 provided a layer of accountability, but it was never going to be enough for Deborah Skelly. Money can pay for lawyers and travel, but it cannot answer the question that has been screaming in her head for over 30 years. While the suspect, Shane Genther, settled his legal debts and retreated into his life in Washington state, the real battle moved from the courtroom back to the molecular level. We are now living in the year 2026, an era where the word unsolvable is being erased from the forensic dictionary. For decades, the fragments recovered from the Fernwood property were essentially silent. Traditional DNA testing, the kind of science we saw in the late 1990s and early 2000s, required relatively large, well-preserved samples. It needed biological material that hadn't been ravaged by time, moisture, or the absolute destruction of fire. But Donald Izzett was allegedly subjected to a burn event so intense that the bone was reduced to scorched, brittle shards. To the state labs of the past, these fragments were a dead end. They were evidence of a crime, but they weren't a bridge to a name. That changed when the investigation partnered with specialized private laboratories, most notably Othram. Based in the Woodlands, Texas, Othram has become what experts call the infrastructure of justice. They don't just look for a DNA match. They build one. Their scientists use a process called forensic-grade genome sequencing. This isn't just a technical term, it is a lifeline for cold cases. It allows technicians to extract hundreds of thousands of genetic markers from samples that other labs have deemed unsuitable for testing. Think about the fragments found in 2019 and 22 on that Mississippi land. They had been exposed to the elements for over a quarter of a century. They had been heated to the point of chemical alteration, but Othram specializes in repairing these broken genetic sequences. They take the noise of degraded bone and turn it into a high-resolution DNA profile. This technology doesn't just ask, "Is this Donald Izzett?" It asks the DNA to reveal a family tree. It looks for distant cousins, great aunts and siblings through public genealogical databases like GED Match and Family Tree DNA. The momentum in 25 and early 2026 has been breathtaking. Just look at the parallels in other cases. In Washington state, the remains of a man who disappeared in 1989, just 6 years before Donnie, were finally identified as Donald Myrell Nelson after 35 years of silence. That identification didn't happen because a witness spoke. It happened because the science was finally loud enough to be heard. Another case in Oregon saw the remains of a lost mare, missing for 20 years, identified through these same genealogical breakthroughs in 2025. The Izzett case is currently at this exact frontier. The fragments pulled from the red clay of Pike County are no longer just promising items. They are subjects of intense forensic-grade sequencing. Scientists are working to confirm if the genetic markers in those charred bits of bone align with the DNA samples Deborah has provided over the years. This is the moment where the corpus delicti obstacle, the lack of a body, can finally be dismantled. In 2026, we are watching a race between science and the clock. Many of the original witnesses from 1995 are aging. Memories are fading. But DNA does not forget. It is a permanent record of a life. If Othram can produce a definitive match, it changes everything for the Pike County District Attorney. The civil settlement Shane Gunter paid in 2020 did not give him immunity from murder. A criminal indictment for first-degree murder can be issued at any time if the physical proof is there. The suspense in this final chapter is thick. Every time a new identification is announced in the news, people who have followed Donnie's story hold their breath. We are waiting for the headline that says the wait is over. We are waiting for the technology to prove what Kyle Barnes confessed to and what Deborah has known since that Mother's Day call. The science of 2026 is more than just data. It is a weapon for a mother who refused to let her son be reduced to ash and forgone. This molecular frontier represents the ultimate pattern interrupt in the narrative of a perfect crime. Shane Gunther allegedly believed that fire would erase the evidence forever. He believed that 30 years of silence would make him safe, but he didn't count on the evolution of a science that can pull a name out of the dirt, and a mother who would keep that dirt in the light until the truth finally emerged. The investigation is no longer just proceeding. It is accelerating toward a conclusion that was 31 years in the making. The story of Donald Izzett Jr. doesn't end in a courtroom or in the soot of a Mississippi fire pit. It lives in the quiet moments inside a house in Cumberland, Maryland, where a mother still keeps the words her son wrote when he was just 17 years old. Donnie once sat down and wrote a poem for Deborah, calling her his best friend through all the pain they had endured together. He promised he would always be there for her, come hell or high water. That promise was broken on Mother's Day, 1995, but Deborah has spent every day since trying to fulfill her own promise to him, that he would never be forgotten. We often talk about these cases in terms of evidence, suspects, and forensics, but the human cost is measured in years of stolen sleep and what David Ridgen calls self-immolating guilt. For a long time, Deborah believed she was the reason Donnie ran away. She lived with the weight of that final argument about his sexuality, convinced that her initial lack of acceptance was the wedge that drove him into the British racing green Miata. She called this her partial truth propaganda, the lie we tell ourselves to try and make sense of a senseless tragedy. By blaming herself, she felt she had some small measure of control over the chaos. But the search in Pike County and the eventual confession of Kyle Barnes stripped that lie away. Deborah realized that Donnie didn't die because of a mother's mistake. He died because of a predator's choice. The hunt for Donnie has changed the way Maryland handles its missing. For years, the system looked at a 19-year-old adult and saw someone who didn't want to be found. They didn't see the journalism student who loved his books or the runner who never missed a day of training. Because of the failures in this case, the Maryland General Assembly has moved toward real change. House Bill 26 was introduced to ensure that the Maryland Department of State Police systematically collects and publishes detailed info about missing person reports. It mandates that local agencies provide data to a state clearinghouse so that no other mother has to spend 3 months begging for her son. This legislation, set to take full effect in July 2026, is a legacy written in the name of the boy who was silenced in 1995. As of January 19, 2026, Donald Izzett Jr. has been missing for 30 years, 8 months, and 5 days. That is more than 11,000 days of silence. Still, as we stand at this forensic frontier, the atmosphere is no longer one of defeat. It is one of expectant finality. We are waiting for the labs in Texas to finish the work that the police in the 90s couldn't even imagine. We are waiting for those charred, tiny fragments from the Fernwood property to finally speak. Genetic genealogy has already given names back to thousands of the lost, and every breakthrough in 2025 has brought Donnie one step closer to the finish line. Deborah Skelly isn't an impoverished mother fighting alone anymore. She has an army of listeners, archaeologists, and scientists standing with her. She has moved from a place of self-destruction to a place of healing, acting as a conduit for other families who are lost in the same dark woods. The civil settlement with Shane Genther was a crack in the armor, but the DNA match will be the hammer that finally brings the walls down. Thank you for standing with us through this deep dive on cold case files. We are a community that believes someone always knows something. If you were in West Hollywood, Santa Monica, or Macomb in the summer of 1995, and you remember that green Miata or the 2 men inside it, please reach out to the Pike County District Attorney or use the contact info in the description below. Don't forget to share this video. Every view is a candle in the dark for a missing person. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a search for the truth. Until next time, keep Donnie's name in the light.